Is she an unreconstructed military interventionist? Well, my guest is veteran US diplomat and now foreign policy advisor to the Clinton campaign, Nicholas Burns. Is the Clinton worldview out of step with America's mood? Nick Burns, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you, Stephen.
Let's start with this piling in on Donald Trump that we see from pretty much all the sort of Washington and establishment foreign policy and national security figures in the United States. Frankly, that just helps Trump's narrative, doesn't it? He's the anti-establishment candidate, and this simply proves that he's riling up the establishment.
Well, it may help Trump with his supporters who are on the far right, but the great majority of Americans who vote are in the middle. They're center-right, center-left, they're independents, and they want to see someone who has the capacity to govern, who has a modicum of knowledge about the world, if not much more, and who has a temperament to lead. And you're seeing, Stephen, a mass exodus of senior Republicans this week, this extraordinary letter signed by 50 Republicans who served all of our presidents in recent decades, saying he would be the most reckless American president in our history. And they're questioning a couple of things. They're questioning his denigration of NATO, his appeasement of Vladimir Putin, and the extraordinary lack of judgment that he's shown, and really the capacity, the lack of capacity to know even basic facts about how the world works. We've never had a presidential candidate like this.
Well, I've seen the letter, of course. I mean, the interesting thing about the letter is that the names on the end of it are longer than the words in the letter itself. But those names, you know, let's talk about a few of them. And people like Michael Hayden, Negroponte, a whole bunch of people, Tom Ridge, I suppose, all of them connected, redolent of the era of George W. Bush. And I don't think Americans really regard those names as terribly credible anymore.
Oh, I disagree. I mean, some of these people, like John Negroponte you mentioned, he was a career Foreign Service officer. He served our Democratic presidents, as did I, as well as Republican presidents. These are people who were part of the successes of the George H.W. Bush administration when the Cold War ended. So I wouldn't belittle them, and I would defend them.
Because of your worldview, you'd rather talk about George Bush Sr., but I'm more interested in talking about George Bush the son. W. Bush took the country into Iraq. I think the consensus view across the United States now, particularly amongst the public, is that that was a terrible, terrible mistake. And Donald Trump's message is the people who made that ghastly mistake, which has repercussions to this day, not least in the creation of the Islamic State organization, these people are telling you how to vote. Why would you listen to them?
And this is the Donald Trump, of course, who supported the Iraq War in 2003 and now is lying about the fact that he did that. He's changed his story completely. What you're seeing, Stephen, is, and the Democratic Party, of course, are rallying around Hillary Clinton, and she's in a very strong political position right now. What you're seeing in the Republican Party, the 50 people who signed this letter this week, but also the leadership in the House and Senate, is a real lack of support for Trump. He has shown on this campaign trail that he doesn't have the fitness for office. Whenever someone criticizes him, he responds in an irrational way. He doesn't seem to be cool under pressure. He doesn't seem to be learning in this campaign, and he's been in it for a year. He's alienated all Muslims. He's alienated arguably our closest friend in the world, Mexico. And of course, he's taken these outrageous positions that would isolate the United States, bring us back to an autarkic economy. It's exactly the wrong way forward in this century.
Yeah,
so
well,
I think the tide has turned in this campaign.
Let me remind everybody that you have offered advice to the Clinton camp, so you're not entirely neutral on this particular issue. But
I'm not neutral at all. I support Hillary Clinton.
Yeah. So let's dig down to, if there is such a thing, Trumpism and what its core message is. You can point to all of the quote-unquote gaffes and all of the comments which many commentators regard as completely crazy. But I would put it to you that if you get down to what Trumpism is really about, there is a message there that resonates with many American people. That is, putting America first, getting out of many of the expensive commitments which in Donald Trump's terms do not work in America's interest, and actually being much more transactional and realistic about America's place in the world.
And that's not where the American people are. I think what he's been able to do, and you saw this with Bernie Sanders and the left, there are a group of Americans who've been left behind by globalization, who have been priced out of the job market, whose jobs are no longer there because they worked in the manufacturing industries of several decades ago. And obviously, whoever is elected president, and I hope that's going to be Hillary Clinton, are going to have to speak to those people. And that's why you've seen Trump do well. But his electorate is on the conservative right. The great majority of Americans are in the middle. And if you look at the public opinion polls, Americans don't want to dig a moat around the country and pull up the drawbridges. There is a basis of support in this country for an active American leadership role in the world.
You know, let's talk polls.
Now, there
Sorry,
are problems.
Nick,
Trade is one.
Yeah, forgive the interruption, but you mentioned polls, so I'm just going to dive in with a very recent one. Nearly 6 in 10 Americans, 57%, want the U.S. to, quote, deal with its own problems and let other countries deal with their own problems as best they can. I can't think of a much better encapsulation of Trumpism.
Well, there are a lot of polls, and I've just looked at the Pew polls, and the Pew polls are among the most credible in the United States. They show that Americans support NATO, and of course Trump has denigrated NATO, that Americans believe we have to be true and faithful to our allies in Europe and in Asia. That's what the polls show. And the problem with Donald Trump, he has these sweeping denunciations of everything that Republican as well as Democratic presidents have stood for the last 6 or 7 decades. I think it's too blatant a criticism of the entire post-war foreign policy of the United States, and it doesn't strike me as reasonable or one that's going to give us success.
One of the things about Trump that many Americans perhaps are interested in is that he's actually prepared to tell it like it is, not just to America's rivals and perhaps enemies around the world, but also to America's friends. And when he says to other NATO members, if you are not prepared to pull your weight financially, then why should we offer our men and materiel to you and lay down our lives for you? He reflects a widespread feeling amongst Americans that you, for far too long, have had to bear a ridiculously disproportionate portion of the burden for defending Western Europe.
I'm a former American ambassador to NATO, and there's no question that we've been arguing with the Europeans to do much more in terms of defense spending. But since Putin invaded Crimea,
maybe it takes a Trump to get the message through.
I was just going to give a data point. Since Putin invaded Crimea in 2014, 20 of the 28 allies have actually increased their defense budgets. Britain's at 2%, France is near, Poland and the Baltic states are all
four nations.
2%.
So you know better than me, Nick Burns, 4 nations right now meet the 2% threshold, which means an awful lot of countries do not. And maybe Trump is going to change the dynamic.
5 countries meet the threshold right now. 20 of the 28 are increasing their defense spending, so the trends are in the right direction. We all want Europe to do more, but NATO is not a protection racket. We're not running this the way the mafia would run an organization. And if a country is at 1.6% of GDP on its defense and it's invaded by Russia, of course the United States and NATO are going to protect that country. And I think the most reckless thing that Trump has said in this campaign on foreign policy is that we would not back up our Article 5, that's an attack on one is an attack on all commitment in NATO. He's also said that he might consider recognizing the Russian occupation of Crimea. This stands on its head the foreign policy of Ronald Reagan, Dwight D. Eisenhower, all of our Republican presidents as well as our Democratic presidents. He is completely out of the mainstream, and I think he's out of his depth on foreign policy.
All right. Well, you've had your pop at Donald Trump, and I suspected you would, but I actually am perhaps more interested in hearing you analyze Hillary Clinton's worldview and foreign policy vision. One of her problems is that she seems to have learned little from Iraq. I mean, she now describes her vote in support of the Iraq war as her greatest regret and her biggest mistake. And yet here she is, still a candidate who appears to be offering the American people a vision based on militarism, hawkishness, and intervention around the world. Has she learned nothing?
Oh, I think she's learned quite a lot. If you read her memoirs, time as Secretary of State, I think a lot of us, and that includes me, I was in government at the time of the Iraq War, regret our support of the Iraq War, and we have to learn from it. And I would not describe Secretary Clinton the way you just have. She is a proponent for American engagement in the world, and that means being true to our allies. It means having an effective military policy and strength. But she is not someone who's articulating American military intervention around the world. In fact, she's someone opposed to Donald Trump who's saying that we've got to have alliances in the world and we have to lead with diplomacy. Trump would have us withdraw from global leadership. That's the antithesis of Hillary Clinton.
Well, yeah, but you have to judge her on her words. In Syria, for example, she, if you look at the record, back in 2012, wanted to provide weapons to the anti-Assad rebels. In 2013, she ultimately made it plain that she disagreed with Obama on the question of military intervention after Assad's alleged use, we all seem to think he did use them, chemical weapons. It was described as a red line, but in the end, Obama backed away from military intervention. Hillary Clinton thought that was a mistake. And then much more recently, she said this of the Syria policy of the administration: it is time to begin a new phase, to intensify and broaden our efforts. We should have no illusions about how difficult, but if we press forward in the air and on the ground, as well as diplomatically, I believe we can crush ISIS. Again, come back to the lessons learned from Iraq. Has she not learned them?
These are mainstream views with which most of our European allies and certainly most of the Sunni Arab countries would agree, and I certainly agree with her on every example that you've cited, Stephen. Back in 2012, we know now that she was part of a group including Leon Panetta and David Petraeus, advocating not that the United States intervene militarily in Syria, but that we actually arm those Sunni rebels that could oppose the Assad regime, and the Assad regime has killed most of the civilians in Syria. In 2013, if you do draw a line in the sand as President Obama did, and then if Assad crossed it and you do nothing, that is a symbol of weakness. And so I think actually she's in the mainstream of what most Democrats and most Republicans here in our country, and I think in many European capitals, think would have been the right way to go on Syria. But Stephen, looking forward, this is going to be one of the most difficult issues for a new administration.
It's important to learn the lessons of history. One of the most important lessons maybe goes all the way back to the 1990s and American arms supplies to the jihadists in Afghanistan. You're now sitting here telling me that you and Hillary Clinton, the woman that you want to see in the White House, believe it would have been sensible in 2012 to be pouring weapons into Sunni fighters in Syria. Do you really mean that, given the inevitability that many of those weapons would have ended up in the hands of fighters who now proclaim loyalty to Islamic State?
Well, I think it made sense in 2012, and it still makes sense in 2016. That if there are Syrians in the Sunni majority Arab community in Syria who want to defend themselves, who are not part of the Islamic State,
well,
or
it's not for you to decide who is not a part or a part of the Islamic State. That's my point. You in America surely have to accept, experience tells you from Afghanistan right across the Middle East, that you cannot dictate the rules of the game in these conflicts.
Stephen, I didn't say that the United States believes it should dictate the rules of the game. I just simply said that in this civil war that has produced 12 million homeless, the destruction of an entire country, the greatest humanitarian crisis of our time, we shouldn't stand by. Now, no one in this country, my country, is advocating an American military intervention. But what we are advocating is two things. Help those moderate Sunni rebels who want to defend their homes and their villages and their towns against this rapacious government in Damascus and its Russian, Iranian, and Hezbollah allies. Number two, you've got to help the refugees. And that means we've got to get humanitarian aid quarters by the United Nations and NGOs into Aleppo, which is being besieged right now, pressure the Russians and the Chinese to stop vetoing those aid columns at the United Nations. This is not an intervention of the type, and it was wrong, I think, in retrospect, of Iraq in 2003. It's simply trying to deal responsibly with the greatest crisis in the Middle East, in Syria and Iraq. It also means, Stephen, that we have got to fight the Islamic State, and that's what Europe and the Arab world and the U.S. are trying to do.
I guess what I'm picking away at, though, is not so much the differences between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. I mean, they're legion and they're pretty obvious. But actually the differences between Hillary Clinton and the 8 years of foreign policy making we've seen from Barack Obama. And there's a very interesting book that's been out in the U.S. for a little while called Alter Egos by a New York Times writer called Mark Landler. And he says this, he says, Clinton and Obama have come to embody competing visions of America's role in the world. His vision restrained, hers hard-edged. Is that fair?
I don't think so. I'm reading the book right now, and I have a great respect for Mark Landler of the New York Times. I think there's going to be a lot of continuity between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton on foreign policy, but obviously there'll be differences too. And in this case of Syria and Iraq, President Obama has actually formed an international coalition to fight the Islamic State, mainly through the air in Iraq and Syria. But now you have a problem, Stephen, as you know, of the Islamic State metastasizing. They're in Libya. They control about 180 kilometers of the coastline. They have a lot of influence in Boko Haram in Nigeria. So this is going to be a long struggle. The European countries have to be involved and we have to be involved. I think that will be a major pursuit if Secretary Clinton is elected, and that is continuity with Barack Obama.
Well, but coming back to Obama, you know, he famously said, and I can't repeat all of his words on air because there was a little bit of rudeness in it, but he said, you know, my mantra is don't do stupid, then a word that I'm not going to use. The danger, it seems to me, is that Hillary Clinton, with a much more combative worldview, and we're not just talking about what she wants to do in Syria or in Libya, but also the way she wants to respond to Vladimir Putin in Ukraine and across the piece with relationships with Russia. Also, her stand on the South China Sea and relationship with China. She seems to be about to put America back into a highly confrontational position with the world's other great powers.
You know, Stephen, I don't agree with that calculation at all. Let's just take those two examples, Russia and China. I see Secretary Clinton very much supporting what President Obama has done. And working with the European Union, Angela Merkel, we have sanctioned Russia over its illegal annexation of Crimea and its division of Ukraine. We have put more NATO troops into Poland and the Baltic states to show President Putin that we're going to support our NATO allies. That's an Obama position. It's a Merkel position. It's a British position, also supported by Hillary Clinton. On the South China Sea, the United States is not looking for a military conflict with China, but we are looking for freedom of navigation. And we do want to support the rights of countries like the Philippines and Vietnam not to have their sovereign waters trampled upon by the Chinese. So I actually don't see on those two questions a lot of distance between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton.
See, I think I do. I think Barack Obama was very mindful that right now, you know, the U.S. is not able to be the world's policeman in the way it has been before. And you talk about this foreign policy establishment that runs through previous administrations, both Bush's and the Clinton administration as well. There was this idea of America being the world's policeman. Obama didn't really buy into that, and he's partly not buying into it because he recognizes that power has shifted, economic power not least has shifted, and there needs to be a new paradigm for the United States. But Hillary Clinton doesn't seem to accept that.
You know, I really think that's unfair to her because what Secretary Clinton sees, what a lot of us sees, is that the United States, by any metric, is still the most powerful country in the world and will be for several decades to come. China's not going to surpass the U.S. in military power or political influence, and certainly not in economic power, certainly not in terms of the innovation of our economy. So we've got to lead. But you're right, Stephen. I think there's an acceptance here that we've got to evolve to be more multilateral in some respects, to work in coalitions. A good example of that was the U.S.-China cooperation on climate change. I don't see a big difference between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. What Hillary Clinton has been throughout her career as Senator from New York and as Secretary of State, she wants the United States to maintain its military power. She wants the United States to lead. But this is a consensus that we've had, whether it's Bill Clinton, President Bill Clinton, or George H.W. Bush or Barack Obama. And it's Trump who's out of the consensus. It's Trump who's charting a new way that I think would weaken the United States.
Well, one specific thing I need to put to you, and obviously again, you speak as a very ardent supporter of Hillary and an advisor to her campaign. There is a trust problem, isn't there? I mean, this is perhaps more of an issue inside the United States than it is with Hillary's perception around the world, but there is a trust issue, and it goes to the use of her private email server for top secret confidential electronic documents, which she should never have done and which she's now been slammed for by the director of the CIA, the FBI. But it also goes to what happened in Benghazi on her watch and the loss of American lives, which many Americans feel that she's never truly given a full accounting for. There's a big trust problem.
If you look at the public opinion polls, that is certainly an issue in this campaign for both candidates. I would say, Stephen, that the attack on Hillary Clinton, on Benghazi, and I've looked at it, I'm a former career person, I've served both parties, I think it just doesn't stand. There was no way that the United States could have rescued Ambassador Chris Stevens and his colleagues who died that night in Benghazi. There have been tons of reports, lots of reports done on this, and I think it's been the right wing that has hijacked this issue and have lodged unfair attacks on Hillary Clinton, and I don't think it's right. And so I hope we'll be able to get beyond that, but certainly there's going to be a dramatic moment in September and October. There are 3 debates scheduled. These 2 candidates are going to stand side by side, Hillary on a stage, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. I think it's going to be pretty clear by September, October, who is the most trustworthy candidate, who is the most likable candidate. It's not going to be Donald Trump. His campaign is sinking because of his mendacity and because of his unreliability. And I think she's someone who can be trusted with American power.
Well, you raise an interesting point there, and it's one that I want to close with. You're right. The polls are favoring Hillary big time right now, and it may be that the American public chooses Hillary over Donald Trump for reasons which have nothing to do with our conversation, with a fairly detailed analysis of the foreign policy challenges and strategies of the 2 candidates. So here's a possibility that Hillary wins power, but she doesn't necessarily have the backing of the American people for the more muscular, more combative foreign policy that I'm trying to persuade you Hillary seems to be pushing. In which case, that's a danger for the United States, because if there's a disconnect between what the president wants to do and what the American people are prepared to wear, that makes foreign policy making potentially very dangerous.
Well, Stephen, I think you've got a point in that, we're a democracy, and so we have to rely on public support. And what's happened in both political campaigns, the Democrat and Republican, is that there is not a consensus on whether the United States should be engaged or should retreat, isolationism. There's no consensus on trade, and there's no consensus on immigration and refugees. So if she is elected, and I hope she will be, a President Clinton is going to have to deal with those issues and appeal to the American people that we've got to have an outward-looking foreign policy.
And she's given no indication if she knows she's given no indication of how she might go about doing that.
No, I don't think that's true. I think on refugees, on immigration, certainly she has given an indication, and certainly she supports an engaged leadership role for the United States. So I think she's going to provide that leadership, but I'm agreeing with you that this is going to be the major challenge, to try to create a stronger basis of American public support and congressional support for the kind of role that we have to play in the world. I think that'll be an immediate challenge of her presidency if, as I hope, she's elected in November 8th.
Interesting you say that, and we're almost out of time, but just give me those issues then where you think she faces that most difficult challenge of actually knitting together what she truly believes with what the American people will wear.
Keeping our doors open for refugees, making sure that we have a sensible immigration bill that can legalize the existence of a lot of people, Mexican Americans in this country, and also making the argument that we've got to be smart about our power. We have to lead with diplomacy. We have to learn our lessons from Iraq, but we have to lead. There's a big choice in this election between an isolationist, I think ignorant, Donald Trump, and a strong, experienced leader like Hillary Clinton. Right. But she'll have to use that bully pulpit to convince the American people that she's right.
Nick Burns, we have to end there, but I thank you very much for being on Hard Talk.
Thank you, Stephen.